All right, well, in this video, I want to talk a little bit more about risk-based internal audit. So, in a recent survey, 70% of people said that they wanted to know more information about risk-based internal audit. So, we've been talking about it for many years, but people still want to hear about it. So, here's a video to talk more about it. And I was actually doing some direct message chatting with somebody on LinkedIn yesterday about this. And their point was, yeah, we're interested in doing more. And people say we should be doing more, but they don't really tell us how to actually do it. So, what if I spend some time and actually share with you a little bit more about how to actually do it? And so again, in this video, I'm going to go through and talk a little bit. It's a short video. I've actually created a 30-hour course that goes through the whole thing, and I put information about that in the description. So if you want to get in more detail, there's a link to that. But first off, let's kind of set the stage because, even though 70% of people say they want to know more information, a lot of people out there think they already know and are already doing risk-based internal audit. So I want to start by posing a few questions and having you think about how your audit plan has been developed. And based on how you develop your audit plan and answering some of these questions that I'm going to give you will help you understand whether or not you're actually risk-based. Okay. Now, I'm recording this live on social media, so if you're here with me, you can feel free to comment and let me know you're here. If you have questions as well, put them in the comments so I can address and answer them. If you catch me while I'm live, then we'll talk more while I'm live. Okay. So the first questions to kind of ask is if you stop and look at your audit plan. Okay, now, based on standards and how most people do it, your audit plan should be risk-based on a risk assessment that was undertaken at least annually. So let's talk about that first, the risk assessment part of creating your risk-based audit plan. Okay. Now, a lot of people in internal audit misunderstand or misread the standard that talks about that. And I'm paraphrasing, or maybe I got it exactly right. I don't know. But anyway, most people think internal audit has to be the one who does the risk assessment. First off, that is wrong. Internal audit does not need to be the one who does the risk assessment. In fact, what I typically suggest to organizations that have an ERM function that is doing a good risk assessment for the company is to use that risk assessment. Chances are internal audit was involved in the process of developing and helping ERM with that. And that is where I would go first if that is available. Because again, if they're doing the risk assessment in the correct way, if it's based on objectives, strategic objectives of the organization, then it's going to give you good risks and areas within the organization where you should go audit to make sure that those risks to the key objectives are actually being addressed. Okay. But if not, then internal audit may need to be the one who does the risk assessment. And so, one of the first things to think about here is how are you doing your risk assessment? What sort of a centric approach are you taking to developing both the risk assessment itself and also what some people call your audit universe? Okay. Now, you may not be familiar with those terms, and I'll do a big shout out to Tim Leach because he kind of uses the word objective centric and risk centric. And I really like that term. And I think it's an easy way to understand. And so I'm going to use that as I'm explaining this. Okay. And so when Tim talks about objective centric, that's what I'm also talking about for risk based, because If you're doing a truly risk-based approach, it should be based on the objectives of the organization. Okay? So when you're doing a risk assessment, some of the questions to ask yourself so that you know what kind of risk assessment you're doing is, what's the basis? What's the starting point for your risk assessment? What is the starting point for your audit universe? And again, audit universe is an old term in internal audit that really kind of describes what was called auditable units or auditable entities. And that got expanded a little bit to include processes and other things as well. But effectively, it's a big laundry list of anything and everything that you could potentially audit. And so, especially in the old days, that would be things like locations, regions, maybe companies underneath your bigger umbrella organization. It could mean processes. It could mean specific controls. It could mean specific compliance requirements, as an example, like SOX. And so when I talk about kind of the starting point for the audit universe or the starting point for the risk assessment, they're pretty similar. It's not exactly the same, but it's pretty similar. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about here kind of relates to both. Okay, so when you're doing that risk assessment that will be the basis for your audit plan for the year, for the quarter, whatever time frame you're on, what are the things that you add to that audit universe or to the beginning of the risk assessment? Okay, that's the question. What are the things that you add? Now, I'll give you some examples of things that people often use. One is compliance requirements. Okay, so you might look at it and say, well, I'm a publicly traded company in the US. That means I have to follow SOX. That means I have to follow maybe some of the other SEC guidelines, like the new ESG disclosures, things like that. And so a lot of people will take those different compliance requirements, regardless of where they come from regulators, from laws, other things, and they will list them out, all the different things that they have to do, all the different compliance requirements that they have. And you can do that. And especially for things where you have regulatory or stakeholder expectations, you need to consider those things in your audit plan. Because if the regulator shows up and says, hey, how come you didn't do this, right? You got to answer the question. And so if that is an input into your risk assessment or the way that you're setting up your audit universe, that is not risk-based. That is compliance-centric, meaning you're taking all of the compliance requirements and you're listing them out, and then you're assessing which of those compliance requirements are more important for you to do. That is not risk-based audit. That is compliance-centric and compliance-driven assessment to determine where to focus your energy and your resources. Okay? Another way that people do this is they may take a standard list of risks. So we used to call this risk models when I was in charge of ERM. And they're effectively a list and definitions of different kinds of risks that most organizations deal with. So they could be things like liquidity, currency, environmental, reputation, some of those different kind of key risk terms. So some organizations will take a risk model or a list of risks, and they will use that as their input into doing their risk assessment. Now, if you do that, again, you can do that, but that is not risk-based internal audit. That is a risk-centric approach because you're starting with a list of risks, not with the objectives of the organization. Okay? Another way that people may look at this, especially from an audit universe perspective, is to list all of the locations, all of the business units, all of the regions around the world, maybe your sales functions, however your organization happens to be divided up from a management or a geographic and legal perspective. And so if you use that as the basis for your input for your risk assessment or your audit universe, that again is not risk based. That ends up being location centric or business unit centric. And again, not risk based internal audit. Okay. Let's do another example. Risk control matrices, RCMs, RCAs, right, that people have out there. Sometimes people will use a list of controls that the organization has, especially if those controls relate to things like compliance, and may end up putting that as the input into their risk assessment or their audit universe. Again, that is not risk-based internal audit. That is a control-centric approach because you're starting with a list of controls. So I've given you some examples. And again, most of you that are out there may think you're doing risk-based audit, but you may be using one of those methods. And there's other methods I'm just not going to get into today that are a centric approach, but is not necessarily risk-based internal audit. Okay. So what does risk-based internal audit look like from a risk assessment or an audit universe standpoint? And so the thing to keep track of here and to realize that differentiation is your starting point. If you start with a list of controls, it's control centric. If you start with a standard list of risks, it's risk centric. If you start with a standard list of legal entities or locations, it's, legal entity or location centric. Risk-based, the starting point are the key objectives of the organization. That's your starting point. Your key objectives of the organization. That's the starting point. Now, a lot of auditors will say, well, I don't have that, so I can't start there. So that's why I'm using one of the other lists. To which I say, really, your organization doesn't have key objective strategies, right? And key objectives that they are trying to achieve. They do, or they wouldn't be in business. Now, you may not know about them, and that's different, right? So part of taking a risk-based internal audit approach is learning what those key objectives are for your organization, understanding the risks that are associated with those objectives. So what are the things that could hold us back from achieving those objectives? And on the flip side, even more important when you're talking about management, what has to go right for us to meet those objectives? Those are some discussions you need to have because that's going to help you to start identifying which areas in the organization you should focus. And at the end of the day, we are going to get down and we're going to test some processes and we're going to test controls, right? That's going to be part of it. But we don't start with the controls and then risk assess those controls. We start with the key strategic objectives. We understand the risks associated with those objectives. And then we find what processes and controls in the organization are set up to make sure that those risks are managed and we meet our objectives. Okay, so let me answer one of the questions that a lot of people usually have. Well, I don't know what these key objectives are, so where do I go to find them? Well, if you're a publicly traded company, you can look at your 10K in the US because in the 10K, there is a section called Risk Factors. Okay. There's information about what your organization wants to accomplish, what its objectives are, and there are a listing of key risk indicators and key risks to them not achieving those objectives. So that's a great place to go and kind of back into and see exactly what's most important to your company. Because again, there's SEC requirements that they have to submit that. Now, I know some of you may be in the public sector, you may be working for private companies, and you may not have that information. So here's another way to find some of that information if you don't have a 10K. Well, look at your executive compensation packages. Okay. Look at how your executives are being compensated, especially in their bonus or incentive compensation, because chances are each C-level executive in your organization has certain objectives, or use the word goals, because that's a lot of times what we'll use in performance management. But there's certain goals that they are supposed to achieve for them to get their incentive. If your organization has a good compensation program, the key objectives of your organization should be included in the goals and objectives of your executives. So now you know where they're at. You can also look at how much of the compensation are based on each of these different objectives. That will give you an idea of how important something is. So I'm just going to make up a random example here on this video. And let's say one of the key objectives is to grow revenue in a particular part of the world. Okay. And how do you know that? Because the head of sales in their compensation incentive plan has maybe 50% of their bonus is based on meeting sales increases in a certain country or a certain part of the world. Now that's going to tell you, right, that is a key objective. Now, once you've identified that as a key objective, then you understand from the executive, what are they doing and what has to go right for them to meet that sales goal. And if you have a good relationship with them and you sit down and you talk to them about it, it's like, hey, Jason, I know that 50% of your bonus is based on, increasing sales in Europe. And again, I'm just making things up. Okay. But let's say it's in Europe. So, because so much of your incentive comp is based on that, I'm sure that there are plans that you have in place, different strategies that you have in place to be able to make sure that you achieve that objective. What are some of those strategies? What processes have you put in place? What people have you hired? What controls do you have in place? What management reporting do you have in place? So you make sure that you're on track to meet that goal. Okay. And once you start to understand that, now all of a sudden you start to understand the areas where you should be auditing. So for example, if there is a particular management report, kind of a red, yellow, green management dashboard that shows how well they are on achieving those specific goals and the sub goals that they've given to everybody, that's probably a key piece of management information. And so obviously the organization would want to know that report actually says what they think it says. And so when you have the discussions with the executive, you can say things like, how comfortable are you that things are going to go the way you're expecting, right? Are you 90% confident, 80%, 50% confident that what you have planned is actually going to work out, right? And again, depending on the number that they tell you, if they say, hey, I'm 90% sure it's going to work. Okay, well, and how do you know that? What things are you relying on that's giving you that 90% confidence? And they'll tell you, and you can understand, again, whether or not those things look like they're going to work or not. If the executive says, well, I'm only 50%, well, 50-50 is not very good odds. So Jason, would you like us to do some work in that area so maybe you could move your confidence from 50% to something greater than 50%? Now, most executives are going to say, well, yeah, I would appreciate that because I don't want a 50-50 chance. I want a 70, 80, 90% chance that I'm going to get my bonus, right? And that's the things that they're thinking about. And so you can start to have those discussions with them and actually identify the areas where you should be doing an audit program or audit project in that particular area. Now, again, let's just pretend that I had this discussion with the executive, and there's some things, with the sales in Europe that they're not completely comfortable on, and they would like some help with. And so together we work through and say, you know what, I think it's, Europe in total, I think is okay, but maybe there's this particular country where I'm not as confident in the management team there. I don't really trust them, or there's some different economic pressures in that particular part of the world that we need to be considering. And so again, together you start coming up with what are the areas that we could provide help by providing assurance on certain things. And sometimes it gets back to the reporting. Hey, I want to make sure that the reports are right. So when they come across my desk, I know who to hold accountable, who's getting off track, what we need to do to kind of fill that gap if we go from a green light to an amber or a red. Okay. Now, there's not going to be a standard work program. And I think, again, this is one of those areas where sometimes people just don't know how to do it. They say they're doing it, but they don't know how to do it because nobody can give them a standard work program. The reality on risk-based internal audits is you come up with a work program based on the risks and the controls that are in place in that particular part of the business. And that's going to be different for each organization. And so there are no standard work programs. There is no consistency necessarily in how even businesses in the same industry would audit a particular area. It requires critical thinking skills for the auditor to actually be able to understand the process, identify where the key control areas are, and then create an audit plan based on that understanding that is tailored to that particular part of the business. And that's why, again, critical thinking skills is one of the biggest skills gaps that chief audit executives are seeing in their team. Interesting. I've talked to a lot of people who want to do more risk-based audits, but they don't have people with the risk management understanding and with the critical thinking skills to actually be able to do it. You can hand them a standard work program and they're a great compliance auditor, but they have a hard time thinking outside of the box and coming up with something on their own. So that's a little bit about risk-based internal audit today, looking at it and thinking, well, is the assessment that you're doing, is it actually risk-based? Is it actually, based on the objectives and the risks and the areas within the organization that are the controls trying to manage those risks? Or are you using a compliance-centric or a control-centric or a standard risk model-centric approach to how you're doing your risk assessment? And if you're taking one of these other centric approaches, it's okay, right? You probably thought you were doing risk-based audit and now realize, oh, well, maybe I'm not doing as much risk-based audit as I thought I was. No problem, right? Now now you can do things different. And like I said, if you want to get more depth into this, because this is I guess I'm about 24 minutes right now on this video, there's a lot more information about this that I put together in a 30-hour course that walks you through exactly and gives you examples. And it's all based on a risk-based internal audit framework that I created because there's several steps that people tend to forget that I included in that framework. So if you want more information on that, again, reach out to me, or I think I put in the description a link back to that course if you'd like more information. So with that, I'm going to sign off for today, and I'll see you on the next live video.